This is not just about border security, it's about normalizing cruelty so we just accept it as status quo and we stop fighting it. Welcome back to Stay at Home Feminist. Your soft girl era starts here, along with the fall of the patriarchy. In today's episode, we are going to be diving into some of the atrocities currently happening in this country. And we're really going to focus on the propaganda and how the government is selling us cruelty disguised as safety measures. And I really feel like the point is so that we as a society just start to think it's normal, start to allow this cruelty and stop noticing that it's even cruel. So I'm here with you to say this is not normal. Let's not be desensitized to what's going on. And it's cruel and it's inhumane. And it is disproportional and it is unnecessary. Let's get into it. I feel like we've gotten to a point in the United States where border security is not just about border security anymore. It's about so much more. And it's really used as this manipulation tool. Of course, I think there should be a process to immigration. I'm not advocating for that not to be a thing. So let's start there. I feel like when we talk about immigration, I don't think anyone's advocating for open borders. So just know that. But right now in the United States, it really feels to me like border safety is a lot less about safety and a lot more about manufacturing fear. Politicians are using it to justify bloated ICE budgets. Guess how much the ICE budget was in 2023? Guess. If you guessed over $18 billion, you're right. But they're also using it to justify like the violent ways in which this is being enforced. And all the while ignoring the fact that a lot of undocumented migrants, a lot of asylum seekers, they are often fleeing some sort of violence, fleeing poverty, or even political persecution. And they're not the ones committing crimes. Statistically, it's way more likely that an American man is going to harm you than an immigrant. Like American men are in like the 97th percentile here, okay? Immigrants don't compare. So if we're worried about safety, let's stop harassing immigrants and let's focus on who are the true perpetrators of crime, which in America are often US citizens who are males. That's just the reality. So if you really cared about your safety, your family's safety, your children's safety, your sister's safety, you wouldn't be persecuting people who aren't the ones putting them in danger. Facts, not feelings, right? Right? And it's not just my opinion. Numerous studies show that immigrants, both legal immigrants and undocumented immigrants, commit crimes at lower rates than native-born citizens. But fear is profitable. So instead of improving our immigration system, instead of going after the people who are actually more likely to commit heinous crimes, dun dun dun, that was like my Law and Order. My SVU. Whenever I say heinous crimes, it's like, deek. Okay, we're not actually solving any problems by doing this. Like realistically, we're not solving real tangible problems for people who want things to be safer or for making a better immigration system. We're not solving either of those problems with these tactics that we're seeing employed today. And instead of fixing or improving upon an immigration system, instead of working to make our streets safer, our homes safer, our neighborhoods safer, our schools safer, leaders are invoking this narrative, this image that there's some sort of invasion happening, and they're like bringing about this chaos that doesn't actually exist to stoke white anxiety, which is often what can be happening. We see this time and time again. So white people, wake the fuck up. Stop falling for this. Jesus. And they're trying to consolidate power, which again is always the name of the game in these kind of political structures. When you look at the reality, not what propaganda is being spewed out. When you look at the reality of what's happening, it's really easy to see that this is not about security. This is about scapegoating. And I'm just sitting here trying with all my might not to be desensitized, not to let this feel normal, because it's so easy to normalize horrible atrocities and violence. We see it with the way that Americans have had to get used to the reality of school mass unalivings and things of that nature. And we see it happening today. It's human nature to want to normalize this to protect our sense of self and safety. But it's important that we don't. And I'm just sitting here thinking, what happens when a government's cruelty becomes so constant, so consistent that we see it as normal? When cruelty becomes policy and it becomes routine, we stop seeing it as cruelty. I mean, since 2018, for almost a decade, we've seen families be torn apart. We've seen toddlers appear in court with no legal representation. We've seen pregnant women denied medical care in ICE custody. city. And yet, as things seemingly get worse, the outrage fades because it's just this constant background hum in our political discourse. It's a slow erosion of empathy. It's a slow normalization. It's like this death by 1,000 cuts kind of thing. We've seen, as years pass, like over 100 people dying in ICE custody. I remember in 2023, I think it was over 180 people died in ICE custody in that year alone. And these stories barely register in mainstream media. And I feel like it's sort of this idea that like, well, that's the price you pay for keeping our borders secure. But like, is it? I don't agree with that being the price. You want to sit and act like America's the best country in the world? Why aren't we better at that then? And like, my fear is that this is how fascism enters the chat. Because the real danger isn't just the harm. It is the harm. And it is the people being unalived by these horrible circumstances they're being put into. The danger is also our growing tolerance for this. Because the more certain marginalized groups are dehumanized, the more that becomes tolerated. And that's just such a scary thought to me. And I often, when I talk about this on TikTok, I get a lot of people, conservative white men typically, saying something to the effect of like, well, that's what happens when you're a criminal. And it's not. Like, if there was a criminal in jail, they have the right to like things that will keep them alive. Obviously, people in jail don't get treated well, and that's like a whole other thing. But like, criminals still have rights. Like, this idea that because someone is a criminal, it's okay that they die in custody is abhorrent to me. And I really, really encourage you to examine why you feel like that's like a valid thing to say. And it's really easy for me to see the way that this manufactured fear has just become a way for people to normalize this violence. You know, they're like, well, I'd rather they are unalived in custody than risk having someone who's violent out on the street. Again, statistically, immigrants are way less likely to commit crimes than native-born citizens. So you're factually incorrect with this like fear. And B, like, again, can you see how that statement alone is just sort of like, it's us or them? It's either like, who cares what happens to them as long as it's keeping us safe? Like, is it keeping us safe? I would beg to differ. I would think no. If they're not the population that are committing the most crimes, make it make sense. Politicians frame asylum seekers as like invaders, as gang members. They paint migrants and asylum seekers out to be this scary boogeyman. And that language justifies violence being perpetrated against this group of people down the road. This isn't accidental. It is propaganda. When politicians are calling people invaders, calling them gang members, even though there's no proven gang affiliation, it primes the public to see them as a threat instead of as human beings. Trump referred to migrants as an invasion over 2,000 times on his campaign trail. And this is the same playbook that's used throughout history to justify violence. This isn't new. From Japanese internment camps in the United States in the 40s to the Rwandan genocide in the 90s, we've seen this rhetoric turn to violence, this propaganda be used to commit atrocious crimes against people. Because we know now, after years of this happening around the world in different cultures, different countries, the same playbook happening, we know now that once someone sees a group of people as dangerous or as subhuman, people are really okay with tolerating abuse, detention, people being unalived at the hands of the state. I think it's really important that we address the way that fear is sort of this gateway to fascism. ICE and CBP have ballooned into militarized forces. They have over $24 billion combined for their budget that was in 2024. That's more than the FBI and the DEA combined. And the DEA is like international and all over the world. So like, if you're so worried about immigrant gang members bringing drugs into this country, bringing fentanyl into this country, why are we pumping ICE full of billions of dollars? Why does ICE have more money than the DEA, who are supposed to be regulating drugs coming into the country? Do you see the ways in which the way we're going about this doesn't make sense to get the goals that people who justify this behavior have? And we've seen the footage. We've seen the way that this militarized ICE does its work, snatching people up off the streets, covering their faces, not showing badges, threatening people who are bystanders, saying, hey, where's this person going? I want to tell his family. What's your badge number? What department are you from? Like, they're just being like, STFU, you're going to be arrested too. Like, what? Like, I thought this was America. What do you mean? Your license plate's covered, you have no badge number, and you're just going to pick this person off the street with no arrest warrant and put them in the back of your car and not tell anyone where they're going. The language around immigration isn't neutral, and it's dehumanizing by design. Calling people illegal strips them of humanity and reduces them to an immigration status. Saying catch and release, it makes human beings sound like some sort of hunting game or a fishing. And phrases like border surge frame migrants as this like incoming disaster to fear, and not as families seeking shelter, wanting a better life. Over time, this kind of coverage dulls our empathy. We scroll past images of crying kids in cages because it's just become a part of our feed. It's just become a part of regular life. And I don't think it's because people stop caring. I think it's because this cruelty becomes normalized. When it's normalized, it doesn't shock us anymore, and that's by design. Desensitization is how systemic abuse gets a green light. When you dehumanize people long enough, when you lock them in cages, when you rip them up off the street in these traumatic ways, it all starts to look like logistics instead of cruelty. And what it is cruelty. It is inhumane to treat people like that, regardless of their immigration status. A 92-page Human Rights Watch report backed by Americans for Immigrant Justice and Sanctuary of the South lays out a very brutal reality of our immigration policies. And the reality of this is that these watch groups looked at what was happening inside Trump's immigration detention centers, and it was inhumane and unconstitutional, frankly, very fascist adjacent. This new report looked at 3 Florida facilities: Chrome North, Broward Transitional, and the Federal Detention Center in Miami. And the findings were horrifying. One thing that's notable from this investigation is that medical neglect is rampant. Detainees report delayed care linked to at least 2 deaths. The conditions described included overcrowding, dehydration, and severe abuse. Medical neglect in ICE facilities has had deadly consequences. Marie-Ange Blaise, a 44 Haitian woman who was detained in Broward, began suffering a medical emergency. People in her dorm in the ICE detention center were screaming for help, allegedly, and apparently the guards ignored them for over 30 minutes. And by the time help arrived, Marie wasn't moving and she died because she didn't get help in time. There was another man, Maxim Chernyak, who was a Ukrainian detainee. He repeatedly begged for medical care at Chrome. He was brushed off, misdiagnosed, and accused of faking it. Eventually, he collapsed. He was declared brain dead, and he died 2 days later. This is all happening while ICE is insisting everything's fine. Our government is insisting everything's fine and that it's just like business as usual. Detainees also reported being crammed, 30 to 40 people in rooms meant for 6. No soap, no bedding, and in some cases, no working toilets. Guards told them if they kept asking for basic hygiene that they'd create a problem you wouldn't like. Women were even being processed at Chrome, which was a male-only facility, and they weren't allowed to shower. They had to use open toilets in front of men. One woman said if the men stood on a chair, they could see right into our room in the toilet. That's not detention. That's degrading. In no world should our country be allowed to treat people like this, strip them of their due process, treat them inhumanely, all because they wanted to come to this country. And like, yeah, criminals should be held accountable, whether you're an immigrant or not. But like, it's important to differentiate between being an immigrant and being a criminal. This isn't a broken system. This isn't a lack of resources. As I mentioned with the funding, this system was designed this way. It was designed to be this inhumane and to be this degrading. These aren't isolated incidents. This is what mass deportation looks like when the priority is cruelty over care. Since Trump took office in January, the number of people in detention has jumped from 39,000 to nearly 57,000 people. That's your tax dollars going into this inhumane mission. And of course, when thinking about some of the ways this administration has decided to tackle immigration in the seemingly one of the most inhumane ways possible, it's easy to think of Alligator Alcatraz, which I prefer to call Alligator Auschwitz, because it's clear to see from what little we know that this is not a detention center, this is a concentration camp. These aren't isolated horror stories. They're systemic failures rooted in dehumanizing policy. These policies aim to treat migrants less than, even though our federal law guarantees basic humane treatment. Don't let them sanitize this. These are not immigration logistics. These are human rights violations. Share their names, share the facts, speak out, because when we stop being shocked, when we stop resisting, that's exactly what they're counting on. These human rights rights abuses pivot the US dangerously close, if not already at, authoritarianism. When the state can degrade people at will, we lose the moral clarity to fight back. We can't stay numb or say it's the media's fault. We need to name it, shame it, and demand accountability, not let it just be business as usual. Okay, so what the fuck is Alligator Alcatraz, aka Alligator Auschwitz? Well, what is it? If you haven't heard about it, Alligator Alcatraz is a nickname for a massive new immigration detention center built in the Florida Everglades, which is surrounded by swamplands, venomous snakes, and yes, actual alligators. According to officials, this location was chosen to deter escape and increase isolation, which reads to me like they're saying we want people to suffer silently. This was built on federal land and fast-tracked once Trump returned to power, and it was pushed through without full congressional oversight, which is really not okay. The Trump administration is touting this as a model for like tough but necessary immigration reform. But let's be honest, it's just cruelty with a very tactical PR team. What they're doing, and don't be mistaken, what they are doing with this camp is testing the limits of how far they can go before the public notices. They're seeing what they can get away with. So who's being locked up there? Reports are saying that it's undocumented migrants, including asylum seekers, and even DACA recipients whose protections are now conveniently under review. In other words, people who were promised protection are being thrown into a swamp-surrounded prison that our tax dollars are funding. This isn't about safety. This is about sending a message that says certain people are not welcome or safe in this country, which is so wild when you look at like the historical context of immigrants in America. Unless you are indigenous, you came here as either your family lineage came here as either a colonizer or an immigrant. Like, America is known to be the place for immigration. Like, is so hypocritical and makes no sense. And we've seen it throughout history where different versions of immigrants were scapegoated and persecuted. And like, when is enough going to be enough? So let's be clear. Alligator Alcatraz isn't just about immigration. It's about who this country thinks is worthy of humanity. Spoiler alert, it clearly is not Black and brown immigrants. We've seen the way that they've been treated. ICE data from 2025 shows that migrants from Haiti, Venezuela, and Nigeria are being disproportionately targeted in immigration raids. Meanwhile, white immigrants from countries like Canada or Eastern Europe, they're not really getting caught up in all of this. And it's easy to see why. The system is racist by design. Immigration enforcement in the US has always been used to criminalize certain groups while simultaneously protecting others. Remember, the 1924 Immigration Act literally banned Asians and Southeastern Europeans to protect Anglo-Saxon character. In 1954, the US implemented Operation, I don't even know if I can say this because it's a slur, commonly used against Mexican people or people from Central America because of the idea that they would come here unlawfully via sea. If you know what I'm saying, you know what I'm saying. I'm not going to say the word, but it's like the name of the operation. Basic, whatever. Google it. In this operation conducted in 1954, 1 million people of Mexican descent, including US citizens, were deported without due process. And now, in 2025, we've got Trump building high-tech prison swamps. Like, this isn't new. This is just more of the same with technological advances. And this all being in Florida is no accident. This state has a long, proud tradition of being ground zero for racist immigration policy. When Haitian boat refugees were detained or turned away in mass, while Cuban immigrants, who are lighter skinned and more politically aligned to the right, were given asylum often with open arms. They're not just locking up migrants, they're criminalizing Black and brown communities. If this was about safety, why is there a double standard for white immigrants? When they say border security, read between the lines. They're saying they want to keep America white, scared, and obedient. The real target aren't just migrants, and this is what I want everyone to hear no matter where you stand on immigration. This immigration policy is a test for authoritarian control. What they are doing to migrants today, they could do to you tomorrow. Journalists are being barred from facilities. Students are being arrested for speech. Whole groups of people are being labeled as threats because of their birthplace, faith, or political stance. This isn't about border security. This is authoritarianism. Legal detention camps, gag orders, and normalized abuse, like ding, 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 that's a bell. Often when I post about this online, people are like, oh, well, they should just come here legally. Okay, again, just because someone didn't come here through the proper channels, I will never support them being treated inhumanely. And the fact that you're using that as a talking point and you think you're eating with it just shows how okay you are with the cruelty of it all. So I don't really want your input here. But let's say that was a valid point, which it wasn't. The idea that people should just come here legally sounds simple, but it is completely detached from how our immigration system works, or doesn't work. For most migrants, especially those fleeing violence or fleeing poverty, there is no like legal line that they can just get into. We're talking years, sometimes decades, waiting on paperwork and arbitrary caps that shut down entire countries from being able to be processed here legally. The truth is there's no clear legal pathway for a vast majority of people fleeing violence, fleeing poverty, fleeing climate disasters. The US immigration system is a bureaucratic maze designed to exclude, not welcome. For many to even wait and apply for a visa could take decades. And asylum, coming here without a visa and seeking asylum, is legal, by the way. International law protects the right to seek asylum. The problem isn't that people are breaking the law. The problem is that we are criminalizing legal asylum and turning desperation into a reason to punish people, which in itself is inhumane and cruel. Also, the US has spent decades destabilizing the very countries that many of these people are fleeing. From US-backed coups, trade policies, and the war on drugs, we helped create a lot of these crises. And then we're shocked when people show up needing help. Like, let's not pretend our hands are clean, okay? So no, it's not just about doing it the right way or coming here the right way. It's about a system that is rigged to keep people out. And today, the cruelty is being used as part of the deterrent. If we actually cared about legal pathways, we would fund them. But now we're just funding cages and camps. The cruelty of these detention camps can't just be justified by some imaginary do it the right way path that doesn't actually even exist. Let's stop pretending this is about legality. It's about control, racism, and preserving a system that punishes the vulnerable while protecting the powerful. Why does normalizing cruelty work? Let's talk about one of the most sinister tools in the authoritarian playbook, normalization through repetition. As we've seen, having a constant crisis leads to public burnout. When you flood people with injustice 24/7, it's normal for our human brains to start tapping out. It's a survival mechanism. From Trump's Alien Enemies Act to migrant children being separated from their parents, again, to news about Alligator Alcatraz popping up between Love Island content and recipe videos, our nervous system can't keep up with the way that we are just being bombarded by all of this, not only through the way we interact with algorithms, but through the intentions of this administration flooding our system with all of this. Because that's the point. Authoritarians don't need you to agree with them, they just need you to be exhausted. Repetition dulls outrage. The first time you hear about these cruel and inhumane way that people are being treated, it's like shocking and like, oh my God. But the 20th time you hear about someone being unalived in an ICE detention center, it just isn't regular Tuesday. And that's what I mean when I'm like, guys, we cannot let ourselves get desensitized to this. The more you hear it, the less you feel it. Repetition flattens the shock and awe of it all. And when injustice becomes just another headline, it becomes policy, that's when they really start to win. When we're really at that tipping point now. And while part of their plan is to flood the system and overwhelm us, another part of their plan is to keep us in the dark. We aren't seeing the footage of people who are being denied medical care on US soil. We aren't seeing like the detainees who have to use buckets to go to the bathroom. It's all happening in the dark. And when people don't see it, it can be hard to feel it, especially when you've already been so desensitized to so many horrible headlines. This out of sight, out of mind of it all isn't accidental, it's by design. And let's not forget the way that they're weaponizing strategic language around all of this. They call it a detention center so it doesn't sound like a concentration camp. They call it processing migrants instead of traumatizing human beings. They use words like logistics and national security and border security when what they really mean is control, cruelty, and radicalized punishment. They're taking away due process from a group of people because of where they were born. Who's next? Who's next that isn't going to have due process? And how do you confirm that someone has done something criminal, that someone is a gang member, if they don't have the right to due process? They're having you villainize people who aren't the group that are causing you harm. Our horrible economy, this inflation, you struggling to provide a life or provide a good life for your family or pay rent or buy groceries or you needing to work 2 jobs, that's not because of immigrants. Immigrants didn't break the system. Billionaires did. It's so frustrating, people, this narrative about like immigrants taking people's jobs to be like such a thing in the US for decades. Let's be real. The jobs that undocumented migrants fill tend to be the ones that billion-dollar corporations don't want to pay you a living wage to do. Farm labor, meat packing, like essential work, and they're being paid like trash. So they're not taking your jobs. Billionaires are giving it to them so they don't have to pay a living wage. Immigrants are overrepresented in essential low-wage sectors, but do not increase unemployment for US-born workers. In fact, regions with higher immigrant populations tend to have higher employment overall. Another thing I hear all the time is that immigrants are draining our welfare. I don't want my tax dollars going to pay for Medicaid for undocumented immigrants. I don't know how to hold your hand while I tell you that undocumented immigrants aren't even eligible for most federal benefits. No food stamps, no Medicaid, no Social Security, because you need to be a part of our system. You need to be documented in the system to even be considered to receiving those benefits. And just while we're shitting on billionaires, the top 1% avoid paying over $160 billion annually. Compare that to immigrant healthcare costs that make up less than 1% of the state budget. Demonizing a mom who's an immigrant getting prenatal care while certain members of our society are hoarding enough money that would end hunger 5 times over is an insane take. It's insane. This narrative to blame the outsider isn't new. It's an old tool of the ruling class, of those in power. It's used to divide the working class. It's used to distract us. It's used to give us these manufactured enemies and keep us fighting for crumbs while the rich are eating their cake. They want you to be mad at the wrong people. While you're stressed about immigrants, billionaires are rewriting labor laws. They're gutting your retirement and they're charging you $7 for cereal. Wake the F up. For real. It's embarrassing. So, how do we fight this authoritarianism? How do we fight this cruelty? How do we fight this horrible status quo that is our immigration policy? Share real stories. Use names. Rehumanize the dehumanized. That's important. Follow organizations like RACES, that's RAICES, Detention Watch Network, United We Dream, and of course, donate if you can, advocate when you can. There are often protests across the US, weekly, monthly, outside ICE detention centers. Like, find yours if you want to go protest. There are people protesting regularly. It's just not making the news. Pressure your representative for oversight and accountability. We want to know what's going on in these ICE detention centers. And interrupt casual cruelty when you hear it. When you hear someone saying like, well, they should have just followed the law. They should have come here legally. Like, don't let people use that as a justification for torture. Empathy is not an enemy of the state. Please refuse to normalize cruelty because we've seen what happens when you do start to normalize it. Thank you for joining me on this episode of Stay at Home Feminist. Like, subscribe, comment, send this to your bestie who loves to argue with people on a night out, because we want to stay informed and we want to tell people what's going on. We want to disrupt the ignorance of it all. Next week, we're talking about choice feminism. Join us as we unpack how capitalism and the patriarchy have co-opted the feminist movement. I look forward to seeing you then. In the meantime, do not normalize cruelty. Okay, if you take one thing away from this episode, it is to try your hardest not to be desensitized by the atrocities our government is committing against immigrants. Okay, thanks. Thanks for watching. Bye.